In 1902, the British colonial government, in what was then called Rhodesia, appointed a curator to take care of one of the largest ancient stone cities in Africa. His first act in the job was to start destroying it. His name was Richard Nicklin Hall. Hall was a journalist, not an archaeologist. Over 2 years, his workers dug out and carted away as much as several meters of soil and debris from inside the great enclosure, layers that held pottery, tools, and building evidence stretching back centuries. He wasn't clearing rubble, he was clearing evidence. Hall was eventually dismissed for it, but the damage was permanent, and it was only the first of 2 separate attempts, decades apart, by 2 different governments to erase who actually built this city and how they ran one of the most successful trade economies in medieval Africa. This is the story of that empire, what it actually built, who it actually traded with, and the century-long fight over the truth. Great Zimbabwe isn't one structure, it's 3, built across roughly 5 centuries, from around 900 to 1450 AD, by the ancestors of today's Shona people. The oldest section is the hill complex. Early European visitors nicknamed it the Acropolis. It sits on a rocky outcrop, rising over 260 feet above the surrounding ground, with an oval stone enclosure, roughly 330 feet long. Its outer walls reaches nearly 37 feet high in places. Inside is a sacred cave that Shona communities still regard as spiritually significant today, and it likely served as the residence of the ruler and his family, as well as the settlement's spiritual center. Below it sits the famous structure, the Great Enclosure, completed around 1450. Its outer walls run about 820 feet in circumference and up to 36 feet high, the largest single prehistoric structure in sub-Saharan Africa. And here is a detail that should genuinely stop you. It was built entirely dry stone, no mortar, no binding material of any kind. Granite blocks were split and shaped precisely enough to be stacked in level, interlocking courses that have survived earthquakes and centuries of weather and colonial era looting. Inside the great enclosure stands the conical tower, a solid stone structure roughly 30 feet high and 18 feet across at the base. It has no doorway, no internal chamber, no obvious practical function at all. Archaeologists still debate its purpose, a symbol of royal grain storage and therefore prosperity, or a symbol of political power, or parts of ceremonies now lost to time. Nobody currently knows for certain. Between the two lies the valley ruins, the remains of clay and pole houses called dagger structures, where day-to-day life happened, and as we are about to see, even trade. This wasn't just an impressive pile of stone, it was the capital of an economy that reached quite literally to China. Great Zimbabwe sat inland on a gold-rich plateau, but gold on its own is just metal in the ground. What turned it into an empire was a chain of trust that stretched over 1,000 miles without a single written contract binding any of it. Gold and ivory moved overland from the plateau to the coastal port of Sofala, in what is now Mozambique. From Sofala, it was carried north by ship to Kilwa, an island city-state off the coast of modern Tanzania that had by this point made itself the dominant trading power on the entire East African coast, in part because it controlled access to Zimbabwean gold. At Kilwa, that gold, along with ivory, iron, and other goods, was exchanged for imports arriving on the monsoon winds from across the Indian Ocean. This was glazed Chinese porcelain from the Ming trade network, glass beads and fine cloth from India, glassware and ceramics from Persia, goods from Arabia. Kilwa was wealthy enough to mint its own coins, and one of those Kilwa coins was later excavated at Great Zimbabwe itself. Direct physical proof of a trade connection stretching from this hillside in southern Africa to a maritime economy that touched 3 continents. None of this ran on paper contracts or centralized courts enforcing deals. It ran on reputation, rulers and merchants who dealt honestly across generations. It's the same basic principle behind medieval European trade fairs and the Silk Road caravan trade, an economy of trust, self-enforced by the fact that cheating costs you more in future business than it ever gained you in the moment. And this wasn't a one-resource economy either. Alongside gold and ivory, archaeologists have found ceramic spindle whorls used for spinning cotton, evidence of iron and copper smelting, and large cattle herding operations, meaning that great Zimbabwe rulers were managing a genuinely diversified economy and not just sitting on a lucky gold deposit. So by the time European explorers eventually found these ruins centuries later, they weren't looking at an unexplained mystery. They were looking at the abandoned capital of one of medieval Africa's most successful trading powers. And that is exactly the part they refused to accept. In 1871, a German explorer named Karl Mauch became the first European to widely publicize the ruins, and he did it by inventing a story. He claimed the timber inside the great enclosure must be cedar, imported from Lebanon, and speculated the whole site was a replica of the biblical Queen of Sheba's palace. In the 1890s, an amateur excavator named Theodor Bent investigated the site, funded directly by Cecil Rhodes, the businessman whose colonial company had just seized the territory and renamed it after himself. Bent's conclusion, unsurprisingly supported by the story Rhodes needed, that the ruins were built by Phoenicians or Arabians and not Africans. That brings us back to Richard Nicklin Hall. Hall didn't just destroy the evidence, he wrote an entire book arguing that the ruins were the work of, in his own words, more civilized races than the local population. His excavation was designed from the start to find support for that theory and to physically remove anything that contradicted it. Hall was dismissed from his post after his methods were condemned. But even after his removal, the theory he had pushed remained the accepted position for years, repeated so often in European writing that it became simply part of the European imagination. The first real crack came in 1905 when a professional archaeologist named David Randall McIver conducted a proper excavation and reached a very different conclusion. The ruins were unquestionably African. built by the ancestors of the local Shona population, with imported Chinese, Arab, and Persian artifacts found in the same layers as local pottery, exactly the trade evidence we just walked through. But it still wasn't enough to settle the argument. It would take another excavation over 20 years later, using far more rigorous methods to force the issue into the open. In 1929, the British Association for the Advancement of Science sent archaeologist Gertrude Caton-Thompson to investigate the site directly. She led an all-female excavation team, including a young Kathleen Kenyon, who would go on to become one of the most influential archaeologists of the 20th century. Caton-Thompson used stratigraphic methods far more rigorous than anything Hall had ever attempted, excavating in careful measured layers and recording the exact position of every artifact, cross-referencing pottery styles and imported goods to build a reliable timeline. It was, by the standards of 1929, genuinely cutting-edge archaeological practice. Her conclusion matched Randall McIver's conclusions exactly. The site was medieval in age, and its architecture and material culture were unmistakably of local African origin.
She presented these findings in Johannesburg. The timing could not have been worse. Just months earlier,
South Africa had held a general election fought explicitly on racial grounds and won by a party campaigning on what it openly called the Black Peril. Caton-Thompson stood up in front of that political climate and told a room full of skeptical scientists that one of the largest stone structures in Africa had been built entirely without outside help. She expected resistance, and she got it. But her findings held, and combined with Randall McIver's earlier work, the question was now, scientifically speaking, closed. Two independent professional excavations, decades apart, using different methods, had reached the identical conclusion. The evidence had won, and the politics hadn't caught up yet. Here is the part of this story that almost never makes it into shorter retellings and is the most damning part. The scientific question was settled by 1929. It stayed settled, and for the next 4 decades, the governments running the country simply refused to let anyone say so. In 1970, under Prime Minister Ian Smith's government, Rhodesia formally prohibited official publications from stating as established fact that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. Guidebooks were edited, museum displays were altered, school textbooks, radio programs, and newspapers all fell under the same restriction. The man who paid the professional price for refusing to go along with it was Peter Garlick, Rhodesia's own Inspector of Monuments, the government's own lead archaeological authority on the site. Garlick's research, conducted throughout the 1960s, confirmed and expanded on the earlier findings. The ruins were built by the ancestors of the Shona and related Karanga peoples. Garlick later described, in his own words, exactly how far the pressure went. A member of the site's own museum board of trustees threatened him with losing his job if he said publicly that black Africans had built Zimbabwe. Garlick left the country in 1970 in direct protest alongside fellow archaeologist Roger Somers. Ian Smith's government had, in effect, forced out its own leading expert for telling the truth about a settled scientific question. So there was not one cover-up, but 2. A colonial era destruction of physical evidence, followed decades later by a fully modern government legally enforcing silence about conclusions that had already been proven twice over by professional science. In 1980, the country achieved independence from white minority rule, and the new nation made a choice that turned this entire buried history into its own founding statement. It named itself Zimbabwe, from the Shona phrase Zimba-za-mabwe, houses of stone. This wasn't a new invented name. It was the actual name of the ruins, elevated to become the name of the entire country. The soapstone Zimbabwe beds excavated from the site, 8 of them all carved from soapstone, believed to have stood originally along the walls of the hill complex, became national symbols. One appears on the flag today, and another sits on the national coat of arms. Peter Garlick, the archaeologist that was forced out in 1970, returned to the newly independent country in 1981, not in exile this time, but to help train the first generation of black Zimbabwean archaeologists to study their own history directly. So here's the full shape of the story. A trading empire that moved gold to China on nothing but trust, proven twice over careful science, actively erased once by a curator's own hands, and once again by an act of law, and ultimately reclaimed so completely that an entire nation carries its name. The walls are still standing. It took the truth about who built them considerably longer to stand on its own.